are considered by psychologists to be hardwired when a child is born. There's about 8 of these that really pertain directly to what we do as teachers. The first one is activity level. This is how much energy does a child typically have? How much do they move around? Do they tend to be fidgety and high energy, or do they tend to be more sedentary? They like to read books, they're quieter natured. Another hardwired trait, this is, these traits are something that you can temper them to a point, but they really are an inborn part of that child's personality, their physical makeup. So the second trait that is considered to be part of these temperament traits is distractibility. Does the child tend to go from activity to activity very quickly? They may have trouble focusing in on one thing. They see something over here and they're immediately off and running. Adaptability is considered a temperament trait. This is how easily the child goes from one activity to the next. So a low adaptability child is going to be very attached to their routines, and a high adaptability child is going to be, more easygoing, go with the flow. And obviously both of these traits have their advantages. A routine-oriented child is going to be really consistent with their practicing, but they're going to have maybe a little bit more trouble taking risks. A more higher adaptability child may really resist that practice routine, but they'll be ready to really dive in with something new. The fourth temperament trait is persistence. This is how long a child stays with an activity in spite of obstacles. So this can be a good thing if they're working through a puzzle, or it could be perceived as a negative thing if the child is persisting in an unproductive direction. For example, if they're in a store and they really want to get that candy bar and the parent won't let them. In that case, a parent would tend to describe it as stubbornness, but it's really part of the same trait. So a persistent child may be more able to really accomplish goals, and they also may have the downside of they will continue persevering in a direction that may not be ultimately fruitful for them. The fifth temperament trait that I want to talk about is approach withdraw. This is how easily the child jumps into a new situation. So a child who jumps in readily is going to be willing to take more risks, but they also may get themselves into more dangerous situations. A child who is more restrained is going to always be safe, but they may have trouble, may take longer warming up to the teacher, to another adult, or to a new situation. So as a teacher, we want to take that into consideration as we format the lesson, as we choose new activities for them. The sixth temperament trait is sensory threshold. A child with a high sensory threshold is going to be very sensitive to sounds, to visual stimuli, to the feel of clothing, to touch. They're going to startle more easily, and those children tend to also be more artistic. A child with a low sensory threshold is going to really seek activities that stimulate them, and they're going to require more of an activity level to stimulate them. So these are the children who would really love being on a roller coaster because that's an appropriate level of stimulation for their physical system, whereas someone who's a high sensory threshold is going to find that roller coaster experience very overwhelming. So as teachers, we can modify our activities and also our interpersonal approach to accommodate that sensory threshold. The seventh trait is intensity. Intense children experience all emotions more strongly, both the positive emotions and the negative emotions. These children can be very artistic. They also tend to be described as by their parents as intense and sometimes exhausting. The last temperament trait is mood, and by mood we're really referring to the emotional valence that the child tends to gravitate toward, anywhere from very positive to very serious and everything in between. The child tends to gravitate toward that same emotional set point all the time. There's obviously going to be some variation, but they're going to tend to have sort of a realm that they stay within most of the time. A very serious child will tend to be more hard on themselves and others, but they also tend to be more thoughtful and analytical. A very happy child is obviously great to get along with, and sometimes we need to help them cultivate those deeper, more thoughtful, introspective aspects of themselves. Given all of these individual differences, 2 children who walk into your studio who have a different set of temperament traits, Even though they're doing the same activities in lesson, they're going to have very different experiences of the violin lesson or of the home practice experience. A high energy, high activity, very creative child practicing may feel like sitting still while someone recites the phone book. Whereas a very perfectionistic child is going to really feel like they're exposing themselves, because when they're practicing, when they're playing violin, they're making audible mistakes that everyone can hear. So the nice thing about practice games is that you can really match them to the temperament trait of the individual child that you have. And it gives them something in the practice or in the lesson that's really in their comfort zone. And I found that I don't actually need a lot of activities as long as I have a few activities that are appropriate for that particular child. Ideally, these games are more for use in the home practice versus in the violin lesson, but I do also use them in the violin lesson, and there's two uses that they really serve well. One is if we're doing an activity that is naturally a little bit harder for the child, they would find it more difficult to kind of get up the nerve to risk failing at that activity. The practice game can make it a little bit easier for them to approach that activity that's hard for them. Also, if they're starting to get tired, they're losing a bit of attention, they're starting to really get a little thin around the edges, the practice game can give me another 20 minutes of high quality attention. Are the first type of practice games that I want to talk about. Now, to some extent, all of the practice games are counting games in that they're all kind of showing the repetitions, making the repetitions concrete. And if you don't do some kind of activity that makes the repetitions concrete for them, a child's experience of doing something over and over again is sort of like Groundhog Day, because they don't actually necessarily see themselves progressing in that skill, and the idea that they're getting incrementally better is a really abstract concept that's not available to them at their level of intellect right now. So counting games is a way to really make that concrete. The first and very simplest counting game that I want to share was created by the mother of one of my students. Two boys, they were brothers, and they were very mathematical kids, and they love this game. And all it consists of is moving a binder clip down a yardstick. So for every repetition, they got to move that binder clip down 1 inch. They loved documenting the numbers to each other, they loved watching the numbers get higher and higher, and they loved the fact that when they got to the bottom of the yardstick, it turned around and went back up the other side. Very simple counting game. Another example of a very simple counting game is this item that I got from the practice shop. Gorgeous little thing. I use this actually with older students who maybe are past the more imaginative games, but still really benefit from something that helps make the repetitions concrete. Because even for a middle school student, they might do something like 4 or 5 times and then kind of think that they're done. And what they don't realize is that to get some kind of result, whether it's on a scale or whether it's on a segment from their piece, they might end up doing it 15 or 20 times before they finally get the end product that they're looking for. And this, even for that older student, helps make that process tangible. So we do that in lesson, and I'll document when they first get it right. So like, number 8 was the first time that they actually had their first correct repetition, and then to start to get some consistency, they may be down to number 18. So again, you're helping the student really make that process concrete so that they can take that very vivid memory home with them. Another easy example of a counting game is cherry pie. I have a number of red beads and a few gold beads, and for each repetition, or for every couple of repetitions, the child earns a cherry, and every 4 cherries they get to put a pie crust, so they can make pies for mom or grandma or dad. One thing that you'll notice about practice games is that there will be more side conversations. The child will talk about different things in their life, but what you'll notice is there's not as many side behaviors, because the practice games really are providing that child with a way to kind of take a deep breath that's recharging them in a certain way, so they don't run out of attention and they're not going to act up as much during lesson. So it does take a little bit of time to do the practice games in the practice session or the lesson, but that time is well worth it because you're not dealing with behaviors and that child is really enjoying the whole experience. Another type of practice game that's very useful is the artistic game, and this is perfect for a child who is maybe a little bit more sensitive, more visually oriented, more creative. An example of an artistic game would be making a bracelet. For every 2 or 3 repetitions, the child gets to choose a bead, and when they have enough beads to make a bracelet, then they can put that bracelet together, and that might even extend over a few practices. This is something that would probably be more appropriate for a home practice where the parent can actually purchase the materials for the bracelet. A similar game that a parent came up with is she created a little piece of circular fabric, and for every 3 repetitions her daughter got to punch a hole on the edge of the fabric, and then once the fabric had holes all the way around, they strung a lace around it to make a little bag. The decorating tree is actually one of the first games that I got. It's very simple. It's just a jewelry tree that I got at a discount department store and some wine charms. Some of the charms I purchased, and then some of them I created from scratch using bits of colored wire and beads. And the game just consists of every 3 or 4 repetitions the child gets to place a charm on the tree. They love designing the tree, what it's going to look like, and at the end of the lesson a lot of times I'll ask them if they want to take a picture of the tree to show to the parent that wasn't at the lesson, and they love that part too. Bead pictures are a great game to use with your students who are maybe a little quieter, a little more introverted, someone who's very visually oriented. And you know, playing the violin is physically exposing in a certain way, makes noise, which can feel very exposing for a child who's on the quieter side, and the bead pictures give them a chance to kind of get back in their comfort zone. They love to make the pictures using the glass beads. It doesn't take as long as a coloring page would take, because they don't have to like color the whole thing in. All they're really doing is putting a little acrylic bead on the coloring spot. So you can use any coloring picture to do this. I have sort of some pre-designated spots for them to fill in the beads, and you know, they'll talk to you about the design that they're creating, or they'll talk to you about, you know, what the piece of candy is that they're putting in the jar. I want to talk about 2 narrative games. The first one is Trolls Under the Bridge. Now this bridge I picked up very inexpensively at the pet store. It's designed to go in aquariums, and children, as soon as they walk into my studio, immediately gravitate toward this bridge and they want to know what it's for. The way that you play this game is you designate a cute little animal, a bunny, a cat, whatever, and that little animal is going to try to get across the bridge. But of course there's a troll or a dragon or whatever that lives under the bridge, and if that child starts wasting time in lesson, that dragon starts getting a little closer to the animal. And the child loves the interplay between the animal who's trying to get to safety and the dragon, and trying to make sure that they get away and get to the other side. The second game is Duck Crossing, and it basically has the same idea. You can use anything that you want to symbolize the ducks, and they need to get across the bridge to where their mother is waiting for them. So every few repetitions you get to move a duck across the bridge. And one of the ways that you can encourage the child not to waste time in lesson is that the siblings are very close. And so if one sibling gets to the other side of the bridge before the others do, the ones who are left behind get very upset and start quacking loudly. So the child is very motivated to get those repetitions done so that all of the siblings can be reunited together on the other side of the bridge. Another category of games is the kinetic games. These games are really great for kids that naturally have a higher activity level, so it gives them a nice energetic reward where they can blow off some steam after they've been sitting still or standing still and working hard on some violin trait. This game was given to me by a teacher colleague of mine. All it is 2 simple cylinders and a set of pom-poms in different sizes and colors. You load the pom-poms in the end of the larger cylinder, and once the child has done enough repetitions to earn the pom-poms enough to fill up the tube, they can plunge the tube and the fireworks come shooting out the other side. Another example of a kinetic game is Stars and Planets. And most of these games were developed sort of in collaboration with my students. I picked these up from the grocery store thinking that they might be useful for creating some kind of practice game, had no idea how I would use them. And what ended up evolving is that each of these deeds was a planet, and for every 3 or 4 repetitions they got to add a planet to the bowl, and they had to get at least 6 planets, and once they had enough planets they were allowed to create the constellation. They love the noise. I want to introduce two imaginative games, and these games are really great to keep the children kind of creatively stimulated as they're going through all of those repetitions that can get a little boring for them. The first game is Sharks and Dolphins, and for this you just need some little beads that you can get at Hobby Lobby. It doesn't matter if it's sharks and dolphins, if it's like butterflies, that's fine. You can just modify the game a little bit. And then I also use these scooping scissors that I picked up from the Learning Store. They're part of a bug collecting kit, and children love to manipulate them. And how the game works is that I'll dump out a bunch of the beads at the beginning of the lesson, and then for every 3 or 4 correct repetitions, the child gets to use the scooping scissors to scoop up one of the dolphins or turtles and place it safe in the aquarium away from the shark. Now, if they start wasting time in the lesson, that shark is just going to start moving closer to the dolphin, and they're very motivated to get right on top of doing that repetition that you want them to do. The second imaginative game is ice cream cones, and for this game you just need a few little brightly colored cups and some brightly colored beads. The cups are the ice cream cones, and for every 3 or 4 correct repetitions the child gets to choose a flavor and put it into the ice cream cup. And they love looking at the colors, they love coming up what flavor they're going to do next. Sometimes if they get a little stalled out in doing the repetitions, we'll figure out what flavor they're going to do next, and looking forward to getting that flavor is what will kind of spur them on to do that repetition. And at the end of the lesson, they enjoy getting to present their ice cream cone to mom or dad. Another imaginative game is Pirate Booty, and for this game all you need is a pirate cup, which you can pick up at a costuming store, and some booty, which you can pick up in the party aisle of the grocery store or whatever. And to play the game, for every 3 or 4 repetitions, the child gets to put a coin into the pirate cup, and you can even kind of mix it up a little bit by adding in some gemstones. For every 4 coins they get to pick out a gemstone. They love picking what color it's going to be, and at the end of the lesson they enjoy pouring out the coins from the cup and counting how much they've got and looking at all the gemstones. These are 2 little lacquered animals that I picked up at Hobby Lobby for $10 or $15, a little bit of an investment, but it's totally worth it. They're gorgeous, and the children love opening the little head. It opens up into a body cavity. They love the textures, they love the colors, and they really connect to the animals. And I use these in 2 different ways. The first is I'll pick one of the animals for that particular lesson, and we'll use it for a counting game. So for every repetition they do, they get to put a little bead into the animal. They love closing the lid again. And then for every 4 or 5 repetitions they get to choose a special bead to put in there, and and they make up that they're eggs or whatever. The second way that I use this game is that each special bead that we put in there, and the beads look all different shapes and colors, so you can kind of use your imagination to connect it to a particular skill that you want the child to do. So for example, for one bead they have to keep their first finger square good. For another bead they have to keep their pinky on top of the bow. For another bead they have to keep their thumb light on the neck of the violin. And you can even make it so that the bead gives them special powers to do whatever that thing is. They totally buy it. They really feel like the bead is empowering them to do that skill, and they love getting to put the bead in after they've accomplished that specific skill. This is another imaginative game, and I'm not sure what the special magic is about it, but it's the favorite game of several of my students, and all it really is a little teapot that I picked up at this thrift store for a couple of dollars, and some very small beads that are small enough to fit through the spout of the teapot, and then some larger beads that serve as the flavorings. So for every repetition we'll put a pinch of the smaller beads into the teapot, and this is the water, and then for every 4 repetitions they get to pick one of the flavorings, and they'll figure out what that flavoring is going to be. Sometimes I'll come up with ideas of what I think would be fun, and it's a nice dialogue. And then at the end of the lesson they get to pour all of the beads out into a teacup and serve it to themselves or to their parent. And there's something really magical about that act of pouring that they really enjoy. Sometimes I didn't know walking into lesson what I wanted to do in terms of the practice game, and I would even say to Sarah, who I was working with, what can we do with this game? And she would come up with her ideas, and then we would create a game together, and it took about 20 or 30 seconds. So be creative, and there's just a few guidelines that really make the practice games work better. First of all, the rules of the game have to be very simple. Anything more than 2 or 3 sentences is going to take too much explaining, and it's really going to be a distraction from the violin lesson. Second of all, the gameplay needs to not take too much time away from the violin lesson. You do want it to add a little bit of distraction. That's part of the point of the practice games, is to be a little bit of a break from the lesson. However, you want to keep the balance about 3/4 lesson activities and 1/4 practice game. Another component that can be useful to have in your practice game is some kind of encouragement for the child to return to the repetitions when it's time to do that. And there is some level of useful distraction that the practice games provide, but you also don't want it to go too far. So if the practice game has some kind of encouragement that's inside of the game that helps the child to come back without actually breaking the storyline, that can be really useful. So for example, in Sharks and Dolphins, if the child is starting to waste a little bit too much time, then that shark is getting too close to the dolphin and the dolphin is getting nervous. Another component of the game that's really useful, especially for a more narrative type of game, is that there's some kind of movement towards a goal. So whether that's assembling ingredients for an imaginary cake, or crossing the jungle, or crossing a bridge and avoiding getting eaten by the troll, or escaping a dragon, there's some kind of dramatic action to the game. Another component that can be a part of the practice games, and this is especially useful for a slightly older child, say 7 or 8, is if the game gets progressively harder at the higher levels. And you'll see this in video games. It's part of the structure of a video game, is that the first levels are easier, and then as you progress, the levels get harder and harder. And this gives the child a sense of challenge, and it also gives them a sense of pride in their accomplishment as they're able to achieve those progressively harder levels. One way that you can do this is by requiring more repetitions after they've gotten to a certain level with that skill. It's worth mentioning that practice games should be reserved for violin practice only. So if this is a game that the child is already used to playing on their own, it's sort of weird for them to have that activity all of a sudden confined to practice time. So let the parents know that whatever game it is that they're choosing, that game is reserved for violin practice only. It can also be really useful to have certain games that are reserved for when the child has achieved a certain level of technique. So for example, you can play these games right now when you're playing hot cross buns, but when you're playing ducklings, then you can play this other game that's a really desirable game. Having a few practice games that I really enjoy using has made a huge difference for me during those moments when a student is starting to get squirmy or a meltdown is coming and a game provides just enough diversion. I've gotten better over time at knowing when I really need a practice game versus when I just need to change activities and which students don't need them at all because they already intrinsically enjoy learning. Have a blast using these practice games, and if you come up with your own, please send me an email and I'll add them to my website so that other parents and teachers can enjoy using them. Happy practicing!